for lack of a better word, purging individuals who have some criminal history, some association with some criminal organization. So we had this in East Germany with denazification after World War II, so taking people out of positions of power when they have been in positions of power with the criminal regime. More recently, we saw this in Iraq with the effort at de-Baathification in 2003, 2004. And in both of these examples, in Germany and in Iraq after World War II and after or during the Iraq War, we saw the U.S. government actually in both cases sort of changing its goals on the lustration once they got a little ways into the effort. So in Iraq, there was a real effort at de-Baathification. There were sort of rigorous policies that were drawn up. And then pretty quickly, by about 2004, I think, the U.S. government that was working on these issues in Iraq said, you know, what we really need is a stronger security regime here. And so the process of de-Baathification was scaled back because there were so many individuals who were part of the Ba'athist regime who were seen to be crucial in staying a part of security regime, staying a part of a government, so that that state could actually be built up. So lustration has not been a highly successful strategy, in large part because governments have abandoned these efforts pretty quickly. I gave the German example, yeah.
You know, the Nazification, they were very bad about the Nazification. America stepped back on this. And then when East Germany and West Germany were united, the West Germans said, well, we're going to get rid of every last person who ever had any contact with any Stasi agent. And some people argue they went overboard. So almost everyone who taught at the University of Iceland in East Germany lost their job. Because almost everyone had some conversation with Stasi person or was that Stasi person. And lots of people lost their jobs and professions. And so it's argued sort of the West Germans sort of went overboard in some sense out of self-righteousness.
Yeah,
But it's a problematic thing to get right.
Yeah.
A lot of decommunization.
And it's a problematic thing, too, because at the heart of it is at least some identity. It's guilt by association in some cases. So in cases where you're not dealing with someone who has committed particular crimes, you know, they could be subject to prosecution in an international tribunal or in national courts. When you're saying that any person who was a university professor in East Germany has done something wrong simply by being associated with that government, that is guilt by association.
Well, we did do something. Every university had a department in which they ratted, 3 or 3 people in which they ratted on the political activity of anyone else. So in my position, senior relations department, it would have been my job.
Right.
Coffee was their mom, and she was actually sort of skeptical about this department. No, I didn't commit a crime. She didn't. But I did rat on her.
But you did. So you did do that. Yeah. So I guess the problem then is in the practicality of it, the masses.
They actually kicked out a lot of people, but whether that's just or not, I just
yeah.
It's a tricky thing that you go to purge a country to make it pure. It's tricky, you know, how much to purge. If you purge, what they discovered in Germany after the Nazis, they actually kicked out every judge who had done something terrible to the Jew. They would have had no judicial system. Full stop.
Right.
Or country than that. So they couldn't.
Do it. And at a certain point, I mean, all of these efforts, so everything here is supposed to facilitate transition. It's supposed to facilitate moving forward. And so at a certain point, if the lustration efforts are going to cripple the functioning of the government, it's going to cripple the effort to move forward, then those efforts might be quickly abandoned.
So I want to ask you civil claims briefly, but what I really want to get to, because I think we want to help you, tell us a little about yourself, what you do. So briefly,
I'll start with the civil claims. So,
and then you.
So I do want to talk about, it's the Alien Tort Claims Act or the Alien Tort Statute, which often sort of blows people's minds when they hear about it for the first time. So this is an old law. It's a U.S. law from 1789 that says people from other countries, so non-U.S. citizens, may sue in U.S. courts, U.S. federal courts, for human rights violations. Okay? So we have a special law on the books that's just for violations of international law committed against foreigners. And this is a law that sat dormant for a number of years until the 80s, when there was a case. 200 years, yep, 200 years. Until the 80s, when there was a case brought under this statute for torture in Argentina. And this has just awakened a vast number of human rights claims in U.S. courts. So this is different from criminal prosecutions. They're private lawsuits. They're brought by individuals. They're not brought by the government. And they aren't lawsuits that are meant to put people in prison or subject them to some criminal punishment. These are lawsuits for money. Okay? So in a lot of cases, you're going to have defendants that don't have deep pockets. You'll have defendants who are far away, so they're never actually going to pay out judgments. So what do victims of human rights abuses actually get in these cases? Well, they get a judgment by a court that says that they suffered some wrong. They get a judgment by a court that says that the perpetrator of those abuses is responsible for those abuses. So in that way, they get that same acknowledgement that they might get from a criminal tribunal. And they might even get it in a more satisfying way, because in these cases, the case is actually brought on their own behalf. It's in their name. Now, the other part of this that's changed over the last 10 years or so is that I mentioned that these are suits for money. So plaintiffs have figured out that there are a lot of corporations that have some connection to abusive governments. So we've seen a lot of cases that are being brought against oil companies, against mining companies for their participation in abuses by governments. And those oil companies have deep pockets. So a lot of these cases have been kicked out of court. Some of them have been settled. So plaintiffs are actually seeing real judgments here.
Have any settled against governments? I remember from the newspapers, someone do the Ethiopian government?
There were a suit that made its way up to the Supreme Court against some Ethiopian officials. So the high officials end up usually getting kicked out of the suits because of immunity. But we still have lawsuits against government officials. Often they manage to just get the suits held off because they don't come to the country. So if they can't actually establish jurisdiction over that person, then they're out of luck.
So, I think everyone will be interested. I'm certainly interested in having a survey. You can just talk a little bit about away from all the general stuff and just tell us what you're working on.
Sure. So
you don't teach undergraduates now, but you might someday teach.
I hope so. Yes. So what I teach right now is international human rights and criminal law, and I will teach international criminal law as well to law students. And my research falls in a couple different areas. So one piece of my research that isn't so pertinent to what we were talking about today has to do with use of force, so illegal wars. That's something that I work on. And then the other piece of the research has to do with some of these bigger questions in international criminal law. So I've done some work on non-criminal law responses to conflict. So one of the non-criminal law responses that wasn't on this list is another kind of civil suit, and that's civil suits between governments. So the Genocide Convention has a provision in it that says disputes about this convention can be brought to the International Court of Justice. And so that means one government against another government can bring a lawsuit. So for years, people thought this just meant disputes over the interpretation of the text. And what we had in the late 90s instead was a lawsuit being brought by Bosnia against Serbia for responsibility for genocide. And there, we finally got a decision from the International Court of Justice in 2007 that said that this convention actually does encompass disputes coming to the International Court of Justice for one government committing genocide against the people of another government. So the beauty of this decision, I'd say, is in the fact that it's calling a government responsible for these acts. So one of the great sort of innovations of international criminal justice is supposed to be that we think about guilt or innocence of individuals, right? We don't want to say that all of the German people are responsible for the Holocaust. We only want to say that particular individuals are. And that's important for reconciliation. It's important for moving forward. And some of the concern about this genocide decision was that if we say that the entire government of Serbia is responsible for the genocide, then we're saying we're essentially turning back the clock on this movement towards individual justice. So some of the work I've done has been on identifying some of the benefits of recognizing some collective responsibility for these acts. And this is discussed a little bit in that Kotkaniemi piece too, that there's some sense that the state needs to be seen as different in some way, that there needs to be some real process of recognition and moving forward, of changing things after something like a genocide has happened, because those state institutions are tainted at that point. And so a judgment, like a judgment that a government is responsible for genocide, allows that state to recognize its responsibility in those old crimes and allows a state to move forward, to accept responsibility, to move on, and to say, things are different now. This is not the way our society works. Another piece of what I've been doing on these bigger questions about international criminal justice has to do with the massiveness of perpetration. So I said before, there are hundreds of thousands of people who participate in these crimes, and the tribunals only prosecute a handful of them. And in a lot of these situations, like the genocide in Rwanda, the people who are committing these crimes are doing it as part of masses of people who are doing the same thing, masses of people who are killing, masses of people who are raping and maiming. And so to pick one out and to call them different, to call them criminal, is a difficult thing. And it doesn't quite match up with what the criminal law is supposed to do. So normally, we think of criminal law as identifying the people who don't follow the rules of the rest of society. And so when we look at international criminal law situations, often what we're looking at is people who were following the rules of the rest of their society. So I'm trying to figure out how courts are dealing with this lack of deviance, lack of difference on the part of the individuals who are in front of them.
Yes.
In the article that we read, I couldn't pronounce the last name, but it was
Kotkaniemi, yeah.
Spoke of Panorama's the narrative evil
Yeah.
and how things of that sort, like genocide, become the normal thing in society,
Yeah.
and they're accepted. So do you think it would be significant to prosecute actually a whole, or to say like this country or this country regime was responsible? Because in essence, the civilians are participating in this act, and or at least I think it's important to acknowledge that.
I think so too. I mean, so the question is it important to acknowledge that a country's citizens were complicit in some way, were a part of the acts of their government? And I completely agree with you. That's where my sympathies are too, that there is some value in recognizing that the people of a country, right, the people of a government, have some role in that. Now, there's different ways to recognize this too. So I think in a democracy, it's easier, I think it's more palatable to recognize the role of some citizenry when the government commits some transgressions, right? Because that's their government. That's the government that's been elected. I think it's harder to do that when you're dealing with an autocratic